But when I talk about the main character, first thing you got to do is when you introduce that character, you've got to create empathy. You've got to create that psychological connection. Well, why do we do that? Well, if the character is introduced in a way that we either feel sorry for them, okay, they're in jeopardy, so we worry about them, they're good and kind-hearted, so we like them, or they're highly skilled, so we admire them. If it has any or all of those qualities, then that gets us to connect with them.
Welcome to Think Deeply, Speak Simply, the podcast that explores the art and science of business communication. Sponsored by Prezent, the AI-powered platform transforming the way professionals share ideas and tell their stories. And now, here's your host, Rajat Mishra, CEO of Prezent, and passionate advocate for clear and impactful communications.
Every successful business starts with a story, an idea that inspires, connects, and drives action. As Steve Jobs once said, the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. And storytelling is not just a tool for entertainment. It's the foundation for building trust, engaging with your audiences, and defining your business purpose. In this episode, we are exploring the art and science of storytelling with Michael Hauge. Michael is a Hollywood story expert and a business consultant with decades of experience helping leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, and creatives craft powerful narratives. Today, he'll share his insights on how you can harness storytelling to shape your brand, connect with customers, and grow your business. So whether you're a leader, marketer, or entrepreneur, this episode will show you how storytelling can be the cornerstone of your organization's success. Today is going to be awesome. So grab a pen because you're about to learn how to make your story unforgettable. Our guest today, Michael Hauge, a Hollywood story consultant who has worked with some of the biggest names in the film industry, from Julia Roberts to Will Smith. And Michael has spent decades helping writers, filmmakers, and business leaders create stories that captivate audiences and drive results. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited for this conversation. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thanks. I'm excited about it too. Let's see what we can come up with here.
So Mike, I know a little bit about you. It might be good to share a little bit with the audience about your background and how you came to love storytelling and the work you've done in Hollywood.
Sure. Well, the love of storytelling, it's really all grounded in a love of movies. Because for as long as I can remember, I probably saw my first movie at a drive-in theater when I was an infant. Don't really remember that. But from the time I was a very early age, I loved going to the movies. In fact, my father, his business was he had like a candy store that sold popcorn and caramel corn and things like that. And he actually popped the popcorn that was sold in the movie theater. I grew up in Salem, Oregon. And so as a kid, he used to let me carry these giant bags of popcorn to the theater. And when I delivered them, then I could sneak in and see the movie for free. I just never got to see any credits because he said, well, don't walk in until they've started the movie so no one can see you sneak in. So I did that, and I've always loved movies. And I always thought, well, someday, I just was so engrossed that I always wanted to be in the movie. I never really thought about being in the movies. I just wanted to be transported into that world the movie created and become the hero of that movie, which is really what I talk about when it comes to creating stories. And so I did that, but that was to me just a pipe dream. I never told anybody I wanted to do that for a long time. I think it was just sort of fear that I could never do it or people would laugh at me. But finally it reached a point I thought, if you're ever going to do this, do it. And so I sort of drove down to LA or fell off the turnip truck and moved to Hollywood. Literally, I was living in an apartment in Hollywood. I found a small film school and I learned how to read scripts and write synopses. And that was my beginning. When I got my first job, I would read a script and write a synopsis of it and give it to the agent or eventually to a producer or whatever. and recommend whether I thought it should be made into a movie. And the answer was always no. They were always terrible. And the pay was wonderful. I got paid $10 for every script I read and wrote a synopsis, and it took me about a day to do that. So I was pulling down $10 a day as a reader, which I know made my father in Oregon very proud that his son had left his teaching job to go to Hollywood, be in the movies, and he was making $10 a day. But that job taught me pretty much the cornerstone of everything I talk about, because I read so many bad scripts and I started thinking, well, why are these so bad? And why do movies that get made that I love, why are they good? And I started comparing them. And I can say that while my career and my ideas and my knowledge of storytelling has grown, it's all really grounded in what I figured out was the difference between successful movie stories that put butts in seats and create a great emotional experience, which a story must do, and the scripts I was reading, which weren't emotionally involving at all. And so that was sort of my beginning. And then as I started working in Hollywood for production companies and reading other people's scripts and working with writers, I started teaching screenwriting. And then I wrote a book on screenwriting, and that became finally my career. And ever since, what I have been doing, first for Hollywood, and then that expanded out into doing it with, business leaders and public speakers and internet marketers and, CEOs and entrepreneurs and so on. So all of it was about how do you tell stories that are, number one, going to be emotionally involving for an audience or a reader, and number two, persuade people to take whatever action you want them to take. Usually the action you want them to take to help them live better.
That's fascinating, Michael, fascinating. So you've seen a lot of good stories and good movie scripts and bad movie scripts. So if you had to kind of unpack and tell us what makes a great movie script or a movie story, what would you say are some of those elements? And maybe you can throw in some examples of movies you worked with or you admire.
Well, sure. The thing that makes a great movie story is the thing that makes a great story for a speech, story for a presentation from the stage, story for a nonfiction book. The principles of what makes stories great are really identical. And the first thing they do is they create an emotional experience for the audience, or you could say reader, but let's just say audience covers anyone experiencing the story you're telling. So you have to create an emotional experience, because when you do, then the story you're telling, it's very powerful because it sort of penetrates to our subconscious. And the way it does that is when you go to a movie theater, so let's say you're talking about Finding Nemo. Okay, so what happens when you're looking at that, you forget you're watching a movie because subconsciously you have become the hero of that story who is trying to find Nemo. And if the story is done correctly, if that character is introduced so we empathize with them, so we are connected to them emotionally, then we experience the story as if we were the hero. Okay? So it's not interesting to watch a fish go after his child. It is emotional to become a fish that's going after trying to save the life of his child. And then all that happens to him is actually happening to you on a subconscious level. And if you want to convert that into the business arena, so let's say you're giving a presentation about a product or a process that your company has developed or whatever, then if you tell the story about someone who has used that process successfully, and you create it the same way, so the story is about the person who succeeded using your equipment or your process or whatever, then the audience hearing about your process or whatever your company does, the audience is going to subconsciously become that character, meaning in a sort of magical way, you are giving them the emotional experience of using your process themselves because they've connected with that hero. And if in the end that hero succeeds, then they've had the experience of succeeding using your your product or your process or your coaching or your consulting or whatever it is you want to do. And so instead of explaining what you do or what your company does, you're letting them experience it, and they don't feel sold to it. It's what I call stealth marketing. You're just letting them experience what it is that you can do for them, and that's what's going to persuade them to take the action that's going to help them improve their lives.
Wow.
Did you? I only gave you one example that you picked. I could go into a number more examples if you want, but they all work the same way.
So this is fascinating. I love what you said. You are making them experience it instead of explaining it to them, and then they become the hero in that hero's journey, and they kind of see themselves as the hero. Any other principles, Michael, you see in the great movies? Like one is, like you say, right, emotional appeal, and you become the hero. Anything else that great movies do? And where I'm going with that is, a big part of business presentations, Michael, is building trust. So if I'm presenting to a senior executive or to a audience that needs to be persuaded, I need to quickly build trust with them. So is there something we can learn from movies about trust building that we can use in business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about creating emotion, that's your ultimate objective when you tell a story. That's the ultimate objective of a movie. The biggest difference between movie stories and business stories is movie stories are designed just to give a powerful emotional experience to the audience. Basically, as they say in Hollywood, it's about getting butts in seats. You want to persuade people, oh, that sounds exciting. I want to see a movie about a genius who works at a custodian at MIT and then falls in love with somebody but won't let her see who he truly is. That would be Good Will Hunting. Yeah. Or in A Few Good Men, a story sounds fascinating or emotionally involving because I want to see Tom Cruise try and get an acquittal for 2 Marines who are accused of murder. Okay, so the goal is to create that emotional experience. The way you do that is to add certain elements to character and the layout of the story. Now, if it's a business story, same thing applies, except what you're trying to do that movies really don't usually do is trying to persuade someone to take action. Mm-hmm. And business stories are usually much shorter. They might be 5, 8, maybe 10 minutes at the most. Lately, movies get going, they're 3 hours. There's a new movie that's nominated for Best Pictures in 2 hours and 45 minutes or something like that. So there's difference. You got to do it in a more, accelerated way, if you will, or a shorter sort of story. But then there are a number of key things. But one of the first tricks, if you will, one of the first things is you have to create that emotion with the hero. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about hero, I don't mean someone who's heroic. I just mean the main character, the protagonist. Yeah. In a good movie, and actually in a good business story too, the hero isn't necessarily heroic at the beginning. You wouldn't say Tom Cruise is heroic at the beginning of A Few Good Men because he won't even go into a courtroom. He's he's afraid of that because of the expectations his father had. So he just plea bargains everything. The question is, will he become heroic enough to achieve his goal? Will he overcome the fear that's holding him back and do that? That's why we talk about a hero. That's what the arc of the character is. But when I talk about the main character, first thing you got to do is when you introduce that character, you've got to create empathy. You've got to create that psychological connection. Well, why do we do that? Well, if the character is introduced in a way that we either feel sorry for them, okay, they're in jeopardy, so we worry about them, they're good and kind-hearted, so we like them, or they're highly skilled, so we admire them. If it has any or all of those qualities, then that gets us to connect with them. So you started the question by saying, what about building trust? So let's say you're telling your own origin story about how you developed this process, or what brought you into the company that you're representing, or how you came up with the formula for the supplement, or whatever it might be. Well, when you tell your own story and you use those tools to create empathy for who you were before you created this process, then they will connect with you emotionally, and that means they're going to root for you, and that will build trust. And then when through the story, they hear, your audience hears how you were able to do this, how you were able to create it, how you were able to solve your problem that is shared by the people you're giving the story to, or how you were able to help someone else solve that problem with your process. Then we've had the experience of seeing, well, you're very good at what you do, and they will start trusting you. And also when you're telling your own story and delivering the story as the storyteller, that itself is going to build trust. Because for one thing, you're not trying to, you may be trying to sell them something in a way, but you're really giving them this emotional experience. You're not giving them some hard sell where they're thinking, well, you're just out for money, because you're not asking for money in the middle of the story. You're just telling the story.
I love that, Mike. That's amazing. What are the 4 things you said in the beginning of the story? What did you say you got to be? I just want to make a note of that, and our viewers also note that. So you see it there. Yeah.
Okay. So the 4 ways that I mentioned you could create empathy. These are the 4 main ways. Number 1, make that character the hero. It's either someone you worked with, or it's your own story, let's say, or someone you admire and you're telling the story about, say, the founder of the company, or, Ben Franklin, or whatever the story is. But you introduce them. When we first hear about them and introduce them, or you tell us about how they were living their everyday life at the start, then you create empathy by, number 1, make them a victim. Get us to feel sorry for them because they're the victim of some undeserved misfortune. So they're in pain for something. Maybe they're in a job that they hate. Maybe they're suffering from some physical condition. Maybe they're broke. Maybe they desperately need money to save their house. Depends on what your area of work is or what you're doing. So get us to feel sorry for them. Number 2, put them in jeopardy. If they're in danger of losing something of value. Now, you see that in movies all the time. If you've ever seen a James Bond movie, for example, he's always in great jeopardy right at the beginning, or Indiana Jones. But it doesn't have to be life-threatening. You're in a position to tell that. What it means is they're going to lose something. Let's say you have developed a process to increase, to fall in love, or to strengthen your relationship. Well, if the story begins with someone who's terrified his wife is going to leave him, that's jeopardy. And so that's where he is. And then you have a process for him to solve that. Okay. The 3rd way is make them likable. And the way you make somebody likable is just they're kind, good-hearted. And the 4th way is they're highly skilled, because it's like superheroes. But also, when we meet Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men, he may be afraid to go into a courtroom, but he's brilliant at plea bargaining. Gets some guy off who's falsely accused of, selling pot or whatever it is. Or okay, and let's go back to Finding Nemo, since it's your favorite. Okay, so that father, he's in jeopardy because his wife was lost, the fish's mom was lost. So he's terrified of losing, and he's so worried that his son might be lost. He's obviously very kind and loving and good-hearted toward Nemo, okay? And we don't see him really as highly skilled with anything, but the other 2 do the job, and we do that. So, but if you have, if your story starts, and even though the person may have a problem, they're very good, a very skilled, say, inventor, but this is the story about how they developed something that nobody had invented before. That works. And I'll just add as a sort of aside, if you think about jeopardy, likability, undeserved misfortune, and highly skilled, all of those things are based on conflict. Okay? So we feel sorry for people because they're in pain, they're in conflict. If there's conflict awaiting them because they could lose their business, that's jeopardy. If they're very good at helping other people overcome their conflicts, they're kind and good-hearted, they're likable, And if they're highly skilled at helping someone overcome conflict or whoever it is, then that makes them highly skilled. And the reason I mention that is because if your goal is to elicit emotion in a story, the number one thing that creates an emotional experience is conflict. You have to have desire in the story to drive it forward, but the thing that audiences are going to lean into more than anything is if it's a story about someone who's up against obstacles. If you think about movies, I mean, the movies that are really popular, they're super villains or stopping a serial killer, or even if it's a love story, there's some chasm separating the two lovers or the two, like you got this genius who's working as a custodian and this beautiful woman who he won't let get close to him. That's conflict. And that's a tool for storytelling that is often forgotten in the business world. When I see, we'll just call them business stories, but professional speakers, or if you're pitching an idea for your company or something like that, it's the danger of traditional selling is, and you need this, but the story overcomes it, is if you get mired in data, if you get mired in the details of all the features your invention or your process has, that can be persuasive, but it's not emotionally involving. But a story about someone who overcame real obstacles by using that process, that gets people connected.
I love that, Mike. And I think it's a good vocabulary, gives our readers a vocabulary to say, how do I start creating conflict in the story? And I'm thinking of our own story for Prezent. And I didn't realize why that was resonating. But when I was a kid, Michael, I used to stutter and stammer. And I had to put stones in my mouth to kind of get over that, the stuttering and stammering. And that actually was the origin of building a company around business communication. Because I went through the pain of, if you cannot communicate well, you'll be made fun of and life is harder. So to me, then that's like the undeserved misfortune. And then
absolutely. Have you told this story? I'm sorry. I'm going to start coaching you here, Rajat, instead of listening to your questions. But have you told that story from the stage? Do you use that story?
That's what we use when I pitch the company or why we started the company.
Okay, good. But then you instinctively, unless you saw one of my courses or something, you instinctively knew, you introduce yourself as the hero when you're not heroic. When you were a kid who stuttered, or I don't know how old you got to be before you put stones in your mouth and so on, you're a hero of the story because you're main character, but you haven't shown courage yet. You haven't become heroic.
Yeah.
But we will empathize the fact, I mean, it wasn't just hearing you stutter, but the idea that you would put stones in your mouth and that's how you overcame it. There's something about that that's so vivid, which is another important thing, is to let us picture what's going on. And so kind of sad that you had to do that. And the jeopardy is you wouldn't have worked and so on. So before you start creating a company, the setup is your ordinary life when that happened. And then you talk about how you were able to do it. And then when it came time to move out into the world or whatever, you wanted to create a company that could help people communicate. Yeah. It's all about communication and connection. So at the I don't know what the middle of the story is, but I know what the beginning and end is. And you began it perfectly because you draw us in, and also what you're doing, whether you realize it or not, is you're going to create a great deal of empathy and trust in you, because who's not going to trust somebody who we connect with as a kid who has a stutter and is trying to overcome it with stones in his mouth? So we're not thinking to ourselves, boy, do I trust him. Subconsciously, we're experiencing you as that kid, as the hero of that story. So
no, absolutely.
What you asked about.
Yeah, I didn't realize why it was resonating, but now I have the words to explain why it resonates with people. One. And then my first kind of big presentation when I was early in tenure vice president at Cisco to the CFO, Mike, I almost got fired because it was so horrific. and then I had to go back and improve my presentation. So I think that's a little bit of your, the jeopardy I was in. I thought I'm going to lose my job, and
that would be jeopardy.
Learn how to be a better presenter.
And you almost got fired because your presentation was so.
Yes, because the CFO really didn't like what I presented. Because I didn't understand.
Rajat, why didn't you call me? You should have just given me a call. I would have helped you clean it up.
Yes, absolutely. So, Mike, let me ask you this. So clearly, in our discussion, many of us love the movies. The emotional appeal is important, but many times in business, people are almost scared to bring that emotional side. And like you said, right, sometimes we hide in data, we make it sterile. It almost feels more business-like. So why do you think that's the case in the business world? And in our personal lives, all of us tell stories to our kids and to our friends. But in the business world, we almost seem to switch and become a lot more formal and less emotional. Why do you think that's the case? And what tips would you give to business people to inject some emotional storytelling in their messages?
Oh, yeah. Well, I can do that. The why question, I don't know all of the reasons there might be, but let me tell you what happened when I first got to Hollywood. The reason I got hired, the first job I had as a reader, reading all those bad scripts, the reason there was such a job is I was getting paid by an agent and later on by a producer. And they hired and paid, it was an entry-level job, why it paid so little. But the reason there was such a job is because there are so many terrible scripts floating around Hollywood that no one who has any responsibility or makes any kind of decent money is going to want to waste their time when the odds of reading a good script are less than 1 out of 100. Okay, let's move that into the business world. Okay, if someone in business has been subjected to a whole lot of stories, or someone who's very long-winded coming in without a good prepared story and talking about something that happened, most of those are not going to be emotionally involving. So they're probably thinking, I don't take up my time with some long-winded story that I don't care about. I just tell me the facts. And so I think their prejudice toward it is just because their experience has been they haven't heard enough or enough good stories, let alone great stories. But the thing I always ask is this, because it is a problem in business, because a lot of times when people are higher up, they'll say, just tell me the data. I just want to know the facts.
Yeah.
But what do those people do when they get home at night? They're not looking at data sheets unless they're really, really committed to their job. What are they doing? They're going home watching television. They're either watching a TV series or a movie on TV, or they're watching a sporting event. But a sporting event is just sort of a canned, it's this team, the team I root for, and whatever my hero is on the team wants to accomplish this goal. So they're not rejecting stories in that context. And people go to movies. They love watching TV, and generally speaking, a few executives might not, but people generally really respond to stories if they're emotionally involving. So I think it is a little scary, but you have to, first of all, prepare the story in such a way that you know it's going to be emotionally involving. But if you introduce an empathetic character and put them in jeopardy or give them a goal that seems really difficult to achieve, you're not going to lose your audience very often. If you can persuade them, just give me a minute to tell you this, and then you go. And by the way, you're not tossing the data out. I'm not saying data doesn't belong in the presentation. I'm just saying start with a story so they're already emotionally involved in what you're doing. And then, because they'll make the decision about whether to work with you or buy your product or give you a promotion or whatever your situation is, the decision is going to be an emotional one. They're going to base their decision on how you or the story you're telling makes them feel. Then they're going to have to justify how they feel and feel more comfortable with it by backing it up with data. And that's when you can say, and we've tested this on 1,000 people and the response rate is 98%. I'm just making numbers up. I don't know what you might be pitching and so on. But it's like, then you can say, well, I know now you know subconsciously they want to work with you. And now you say, and other people have worked with me besides the person in this story. We've had success with this many people, and it's cost this much money. Or other companies that have worked with us have increased their revenue stream by 50% a year for the last 3 years, or whatever. But don't lead what I'm begging you to do is don't lead with the data and end with the story. Get them emotionally involved with the story and then substantiate what you're asking to do, justify it with the data, with the facts and figures.
So let me play that back, because I think there were many great nuggets there, Michael. So you're saying first, people are biased because they've read those 99 out of 100 bad scripts or heard bad stories.
Yeah.
That's a part of it. It takes effort to create a good story. And if you do that, you can capture the audience, because even the execs are going back and in their spare time listening to stories, or like you said, live sports is also, can the Kansas City Chiefs do a three-peat? And no one has ever done it before in the past, right? There's a story in every sporting event as well. So that's super helpful. Can you share an example, Michael, of a brand or a business you think that has done a great job of bringing in storytelling into their messaging or marketing?
Yeah. Okay, if I may, let me give you an example of the first person outside of Hollywood that ever hired me to help them with their story. This was in the internet marketing world, and it was a person named Matt Basek. He's been a high-level internet marketer for some time now, probably 20 years. And he called me, and he knew me because he had seen a video I did called The Hero's Two Journeys that was designed for screenwriters and novelists. But the video sort of made its rounds. It was also the video that Will Smith saw before he called and asked me to work with him on the script for I Am Legend. Okay, so Matt, this guy, I get a call from him, and he says, my name is Matt Basek. I'm calling from Atlanta, and I was living in LA. And he said, I'm an internet marketer, and I want to make an offer. So I'm creating a webinar, and I want a story that's going to be part of my webinar that I think will help persuade people to buy what I'm selling. He had a course that he was offering. And so I said, well, Matt, that sounds great. I should confess, I don't know what internet marketing is, and I've never heard of a webinar, so I don't know if I'm your guy. He said, no, that's okay. All I want is your help with the story. I can do the rest. So I thought to myself, well, okay, if he wants to pay me, if he's willing to fly out from Atlanta to meet with me personally in LA, he probably will pay me a decent amount of money, more than $10 a script. So I said, sure. So he came out. And the story he wanted to tell was why he was being investigated for no reason, because he wasn't guilty, had never done anything, but investigated by the IRS. And so he said, so they investigated me, and the result was they investigated him. They wouldn't tell him why. And so to get rid of this investigation, his lawyer said, you have to close down your entire business. You have to shut it all down. You can't do that anymore. And so because otherwise you could go to jail, and they won't tell us why you're being investigated anyway. So he had to do that. And the course he was showing was on how you can become an internet marketer. And he wanted the story so he could show people that even when he had to shut everything down and start from scratch, it was this easy to do it because he knew the principles of doing it. So he's trying to sell this course, and all the data was, I made this and so on. But he wanted a thing. So I said, okay, that's a good idea. Tell a story about that. But I said, don't start the story by saying the IRS was investigating me. That's giving it away. Let's start with your ordinary life. And he said, you were working at this thing. You didn't know this was going on. When did they come, and when did you hear from them? He said, well, they came and knocked on my door, and I didn't know they were going to even be there. I said, well, what time of day? He said, well, it was first thing in the morning. He said, okay, so open the story with you sitting at breakfast with your family, and you hear the knock on the door. And I kept saying, now, if this were a movie, you would let them in, and don't just say what they said generally. Let's hear what they said. Let's hear the dialogue, because the movie has good dialogue. And then that puts you in jeopardy. So then you've got to talk about what were you had to come up with that, and what were the steps you took, and what were the obstacles? Because one of them was he said, I was determined not to stiff my employees and my customers that had paid me. So he had to pay them all back before he could shut down his business. So everything I said, well, if this were a movie, I kept saying I'd do this. And I don't know anything about internet marketing. I don't know a webinar, but I know how stories work. And so he put that story into his webinar. Yeah. And not only did that webinar work really well, but a few years later, he gave an unrequested testimonial. I was going to be on somebody's podcast or something like that. And he said, well, Michael Hauge's going to be there. And his quote was something like, and I should tell you that the story he picked out of my brain, I've used it again and again in a number of webinars, and I figure I've probably made about $10 million on that script, on that story. And the first thing I realized with some degree of embarrassment was I should have charged him more. I should have asked for a piece of the action instead of just saying, oh, I'll take $1,000 or whatever I charged him. But the other thing was, and that was really a turning point for me, is I realized, okay, it doesn't matter that my background's in Hollywood. Stories are stories are stories. And what I guided him to do in his story was all based on what I had learned or the processes I had developed working as a story consultant in Hollywood for the previous 20 years or whatever it was. So that's it. And I could go on and on, but there are a number of clients I have who have said they've made millions of dollars off of knowing how to do this, how to
That's
tell
incredible. That is a great story in itself, Michael. And I'm also reflecting on how you introduced yourself as a child sneaking in with popcorn, using some of those principles that you just kind of described, right? So that's, it's a story in a story. That's awesome. So let's move to one of my favorite sections, Michael, the quick fire. So I'm going to give you.
We're there already. You warned me about the quick fire. Now I forgot about it. Now I'm all nervous again. Now I'm in jeopardy. Now I've got these obstacles.
Yes, okay. I have not told you about the questions, so that creates more jeopardy for you. But
they're storytelling questions, though, right?
Correct.
You're not going to speak about politics or romance or anything, because I don't know anything about any of those things. Just things I know. Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah, all right. So it's about storytelling and communication. So what is one word, Michael, you would use to describe the art of storytelling?
Emotion.
What is a common storytelling myth you wish people would unlearn?
Jeez, a myth. And I only get one.
That people
I already said one of them about the myth that business owners, or you think business owners won't like it. I would say that that telling stories is really hard.
Excellent.
Yeah. I'd like to go on, because they're not. You've been telling stories all your life. You just don't know some of the tricks, but they're not that hard.
That's great. If there was one piece of advice, Michael, you could give someone who's preparing for a big presentation in the business world, what would it be?
Keep it, only one. I was going to have two words. The two words would be, number one, keep it simple. And if I slipped in another, simple and vivid.
Vivid.
Create a movie in the mind of the reader, but simple is number one. The biggest mistake most storytellers make is their story becomes too complicated and meandering. And a good, this is supposed to be hot seat, so I shouldn't keep, adding. But if you think about movies, if you think about the biggest money-making movies in Hollywood, you can summarize what the plot is in a single sentence very easily. A fish whose son is swept away has to go after and find him, even though he's been spirited off to Australia.
Yeah. Yes, simple. And then Michael, you've had an amazing career. You've helped so many people. What is something you wish you knew about storytelling when you started your career?
About storytelling. Yeah, I was anticipating this question, and I thought it was going to be, if there was something I was going to advise myself as a young person to do, it wouldn't be about storytelling per se. So I'll give you that. It has to do with my career more than storytelling. But the advice I would give myself, took me a long time to learn, is only do what's fun. Only do what's fun. Because every success I've ever had in my career, in Hollywood or in business, is when I stopped worrying about anything you're supposed to do, like networking, terrible at that, marketing, not good at that. The things that have been successful is when I say, I would love to go on this podcast just to talk about story. I love coaching people. I love teaching storytelling. And when I do those things just because that sounds fun, it doesn't mean they're not hard, and it doesn't mean they're always a barrel of laughs, but it means fun to me means 100% into what you're doing. That would be my advice. And that would be advice to everybody. The more you can stick with what do you love and find a way to get paid to do that and have fun with it, the better off you'll be. The more you will advance in your career.
Awesome, Michael. This was super fun. And thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights. And your advice, Michael, has shown us how storytelling can be a foundation for building not just a business, but also connections. So before we wrap up, Michael, any final thoughts or resources you'd like to share with our listeners, and where can they connect with you to learn more about you and your work? Any website or newsletter that you would recommend?
Sure. So the first thing, when I was sort of picking apart your story and how you put it together, and what I've been saying, there is a structure, there is a formula, if you will, or a way to lay out stories that's very simple. It really involves taking the hero through 6 steps. You set up, they have a problem. They take these steps. They encounter these obstacles. There's a climax where they achieve their goal, and there's an aftermath. And those 6 steps you will find in every Hollywood movie, pretty much, in every good story. And so anyone who's listening who wants to see a very simple chart that lays out what those 6 steps are, in the notes for this, or in the notes that accompany the audio part of it, you'll have a link, and you can go to the link and you can just download that chart for free. It's hollywoodstoryselling.com/chart if you're listening to this and want to jot it down, but I think it'll be in the show notes.
Yes, sir.
And if you want generally to get in touch with me to find out about my coaching or appearances or my books or my course or whatever it might be, just go to my website, which is storymastery.com. And there's articles there. You can learn more and find out more than you ever wanted to know about me, and find out how we might work together, either in a presentation or one-on-one coaching or whatever it might be. And was there something else you said besides? That's how people can connect with me, and that's awesome. How they get something that will help them with their own story.
So what we'll do, Michael, is we'll definitely put in the show notes both the hollywoodstoryselling.com/chart and your website as well, so people get in touch with you. This has been super fun, Michael.
It has been.
For joining us. And then, folks, next week, we'll continue exploring the art of communication with another incredible guest. Until then, let's think deeply, speak simply. See you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Think Deeply, Speak Simply. This episode was brought to you by Prezent, your secret weapon for brilliant presentations. Visit Prezent.ai to transform how you communicate. Until next time, keep thinking deeply and speaking simply.